I'd like to turn it over to Nick DiNiccolo, who's a member of our advisory committee and president of Hatchmont McDonald and a great supporter of our alliance. Thank you, Nick.
Good morning, and thank you. So, yes, I'm pleased to be a member of the Alliance over the last year, so it's just fascinating to hear what's going on. I'm an engineer by training since over the last 40 years, and I could tell you the challenges ahead, even for us as engineers, to be able to deal with what is occurring is just absolutely mind-boggling, and just to be able to deal with the resiliency and the sustainability is going to be a fantastic challenge. The objective of this particular panel is to provide a national overview of leading practices, innovations, and trends for climate change preparedness and resilience in the agriculture, coastal communities, and national resource sectors. Now, each of our panelists will make about a 15 to 20-minute presentation, and I will ask that the audience hold their questions until all three panelists are finished with their presentations. I'd like to now introduce you to our three panelists. Their detailed bios are just fantastic. They're in the packets here, so I'll just give you a quick overview. First, we'll have William Hohenstein, who's the director of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Climate Change Program Office, which serves as the focal point for all support to the Secretary of Agriculture on the causes and consequences of climate change, as well as the strategies for addressing these challenges. By the way, Bill is also a distinguished alum of Rutgers University, so welcome back. We also have Margaret Davidson, who's the director of NOAA Coastal Services Center. Margaret has focused her professional work on environmentally sustainable agriculture, mitigation of coastal hazards, and impacts of climate variability on coastal resources. And our final panelist this morning in panel one is Bruce Stein. And Bruce is the Director of Office for Climate Change Adaptation of the National Wildlife Federation. And in this capacity, Dr. Stein leads the National Wildlife Federation's work on safeguarding wildlife and their habitats in the face of a changing climate. So right now, I'd like to invite Bill to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And not only am I a Rutgers grad, but I'm a Cook grad as well. And so I spent a lot of time roaming around this campus a long, long time ago. Are there any farmers in the audience? Oh, two, that's great. Anyone who likes food? All right, there we go. I'm going to focus on the relationship between climate change and agriculture and the role that USDA plays in helping to address climate change. And when we think about agriculture in the U.S., we generally think about the Corn Belt, we think about states of California, but New Jersey is the garden state, and agriculture is a significant part of New Jersey's economy. And it's about a $1.1 billion industry within the state, mainly for specialty crops. So I spend a lot of time talking to farmers and farm groups about climate change, and they can be a skeptical audience. And it's important to talk to them in terms that they can relate to and understand. I think we heard a lot just recently about Hurricane Sandy and the impact that it had in New Jersey. For farmers throughout the U.S., the event that is really crystallizing their views about climate change are the recent droughts that we felt in the Midwest. And in fact, for USDA, there's a lot we can learn about both the drought itself and the response that farmers had to the drought as a starting point for our actions to help them adapt to climate change. So, there we go. So, first off, why do farmers need to care about climate change? Well, climate is critical to agriculture and to forestry. Not only are plants affected by temperature and precipitation, but CO2 concentrations act as a fertilizer, and increasing CO2 concentrations can actually increase crop productivity. And throughout the U.S., the effects of climate change on agriculture are very complex. We look at the effects of drought, the effects of extreme events, but also longer growing seasons. In some regions of the country, like New Jersey, we're seeing more water, more moisture availability, and we see the CO2 fertilization effect. Agriculture also has an important role in contributing to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. In the U.S., agriculture is responsible for about 6% of emissions. Globally, agriculture is 13 to 15% of direct greenhouse gas emissions, and when you add in the emissions from land use change, the land sector is responsible for about a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's really difficult to solve the problem of climate change without addressing the role that agriculture and land use plays. And it turns out there are many things that farmers can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestration. This I'm going to go through pretty quickly because some of it was already covered. The climate is changing. And in fact, when I talk to farmers, that's one thing that I say straight out, whether they believe it or not. What's interesting is that many farmers, in fact, most farmers, are already responding to these changes. If you ask them about their practices and what they are today versus 20 years ago, they're different. They're putting in tile to deal with excess moisture. They're planting earlier. They're planting different cultivars. They're looking at drought-tolerant crops. And so whether they talk about climate change, they're certainly talking about climate variability, and you can kind of assess where they are based on what they're doing, and they're adapting to the changes they're seeing. The pace of change has accelerated, and that's one of the things that really is important for farmers to understand. This last decade was the warmest on record, and in fact, 2012 was the warmest year on record by almost a full degree above the next closest year. And so as we look to the future, and this is, the future is a little fuzzy, we expect to see not only continued change, whether we can stabilize greenhouse gas emissions or not, but the rate of change is going to accelerate. And so if we can't get greenhouse gas emissions under control, we can expect to see decadal rates of change of about 0.6 to 0.8 degrees, where currently what we're seeing is about 0.2 degrees. And that's really significant for agriculture. We're seeing that farmers can adapt to the changes they're seeing today, but as we move to a world where not only is the climate continuing to change, but the rate of change is accelerating, adaptation strategies are going to become more difficult. USDA is helping. One of the things we're doing is we're producing a lot of science. We spend about $100 million a year on research. A lot of it is focused on very applied elements, technologies, and practices that can help farmers adapt to climate change. We put out periodic assessments as part of the U.S. government's National Climate Assessment report, and those assessments are really the basis for making decisions on sound science. Again, I think Margaret may cover this if folks haven't, but not only are we seeing changes in temperature, and those changes in the future are uncertain, but consistent across the U.S., we see a lot of variability in terms of changes in future precipitation across models and across regions. And so while the models pretty much are consistently telling us that temperatures are going to increase, where you are and sort of how climate change plays out will really determine whether we see drier summers, warmer, wetter summers, and changes in moisture availability. Again, some of the results from our most recent assessment, we looked in great detail at some of the more important commodity crops within the U.S., and it turns out that these crops are affected mostly by moisture and extremes. And so to the extent we see greater variability, more heat waves, more extreme weather events, that's going to affect crops like corn and soybeans and cotton that have very specific climate requirements at very specific points in their development. And so, like last year, if you get very hot temperatures during pollination or during grain set, you can in fact lose a significant portion of your crop. And in fact, last year was a really good example of that. The effects of climate change across the country are not consistent, and as we look to positioning USDA to deal with climate change and to help our stakeholders, our farmers, our ranchers, our rural landowners, we're going to be taking a regional approach. And we're going to be working with the groups that we've traditionally worked with, the land-grant universities, extension, crop consultants, the seed companies, as we roll out our strategies to help farmers adapt to the changes we're seeing. And in the Northeast, there are likely to be some benefits for certain crops. We're already seeing longer growing season. We're also seeing an increase in certain pests that we haven't seen traditionally in the Northeast. The Northeast in particular grows a lot of specialty crops. I think New Jersey grows a lot of blueberries, cranberries, peaches, crops with very small acreage requirements, but very specific requirements when it comes to soil and climate. And these crops in particular can be quite vulnerable to change. In the North Central, which is really the Corn Belt, we're concerned about increases in extreme events and precipitation events, in particular some of the trends that were shown previously about these gully washers, the fact that we're getting more precipitation and large chunks and extreme events is increasing soil erosion, heat waves, wet springs, which were a problem pretty much throughout the North Central region through the last decade up until last year, and overall benefits from longer growing seasons as well. In the Southeast, a lot of concern about increases in invasives, increased pests and pathogens, and drought. The Northern Plains, water is really a critical issue there, and it's going to continue to be. Also, that's true in the Southern Plains. This drought that we've seen just in the past year is really a 2 to 3 year drought in parts of Texas and Oklahoma. And then we get to some of the issues in the western states where wildfire, brush management, forest management, and forest health are really critical. And again, that's also true as we head out to the West Coast. And so when we talk about adaptation responses, we can't talk about a national response. We really need to get down to the regional level, and within that we need to get down to the local level and work with folks on the ground in the states. You're going to hear, I think, about New Jersey agriculture this afternoon. I'm not going to say much about it other than that it is an important industry for the state, and in particular, there are crops that, this map shows crops that are the top 15 with regard to acreage. Cranberries, which is one of your significant crops, doesn't even show up on that because it's such a small acreage. And crops like blueberries, let me see if I can do this. This is sort of your blueberry area right here. I think New Jersey is number 4 or 5 in the country in terms of blueberries, and all of the blueberries come from this small area. You can also see there's a lot of urban area in New Jersey. And so when we think about migration as a strategy for some of these crops, that may not be a viable strategy in a state like New Jersey. The thing about specialty crops is they do have relatively small acreage. They tend to be high valued, which means that many mitigate or adaptation strategies which might not be available to some farmers might be viable for these farms. So I'm going to get into sort of what the strategies are for farmers, starting with row crops. And here, there are really 3 or 4 major components. Certainly genetics, getting improved crops in the field, crops that are bred for drought tolerance and high temperatures. Again, if we look at last year's drought as a laboratory, the genetic improvements we've made in our corn and our soybeans over the past 20 or 30 years have really benefited agriculture and helped farmers deal with extreme events. We had a major drought, a similar drought in 1988, but the effects on farms were much greater than last year, in part because the crops are better now. They have bigger root systems, they have deeper root systems, and they were better able to withstand drought. Conservation is also critical. Farms that did well had better organic matter in the soils, and conservation practices, things like conservation tillage, no-till, the use of cover crops, the use of organic amendments, can all improve soil quality, and with better soils, you get better water retention and better able to withstand things like drought and extreme events. In fact, if you look at, this was last year, a farm, side-by-side farms in Indiana, where this farm had 11 years of continuous no-till and cover crops, and this farm used pretty conventional tillage practices And you can see the difference in the outcomes last year, virtually with, the same crop and similar underlying conditions. And the effective conservation practices was really dramatic last year, pretty much across the Midwest. When it comes to specialty crops, again, breeding and genetics is going to be important. Looking at cultivars that are already out there, and I know there are some iconic crops in New Jersey, Jersey peaches, Jersey tomatoes. There may be cultivars in places like Georgia that might become more viable for New Jersey as we look to the climate conditions that we're going to be seeing over the next century. In addition, there are some relatively expensive practices, but that might be viable, things like canopy pruning, irrigation systems, use of shading, that probably aren't necessarily viable for row crop agriculture, but when it comes to specialty crops, given their high value, makes some sense. When it comes to livestock, this is sort of the forgotten part of agriculture when it comes to climate change. Turns out that livestock, like people, don't like it when it's too hot. They can shut down. It can cause reductions in production. It can also cause mortality. And so selecting for breeds and types that are more tolerant to heat, looking at the nutritional requirements of livestock, especially during heat waves, providing shade and cooling and ventilation, and then managing the grazing systems in a way that's going to accommodate things like drought and climate variability. And water management, it's not something we necessarily think about too much in a state like New Jersey that doesn't have a long history of drought, but as we look to the future, it's not going to be like the past, and there are going to be needs for water storage on farm, certainly improved irrigation systems. Irrigation can be an important adaptation strategy, but the source of water is important, making sure it's sustainable, and then how it's used, making sure it's used in an efficient way. And then finally, there are overarching parts of our response, and USDA is focused on these. When we think about our national response to climate adaptation in agriculture, a large part of that is going to be improving access to information about climate change, information about technologies and practices, but also information about things like drought. We have a drought early warning system that we've put in place with our cooperators in NOAA. This is quite valuable looking at drought conditions last year. It was very helpful to farmers. Continued research and development, as I mentioned, genetics is going to be a part of this, doing field trials of various conservation practices and various alternatives to make sure we understand how they function under changing climate conditions, and then helping farmers manage risk. One of the things, again, as consumers of food, we need a stable food supply into the future. We need farmers to take on risk, given that we're expecting not only change, but increases in variability. We don't necessarily want to see farmers become risk averse. And so programs to help farmers manage risk will be important. And then finally, working at a regional level. We're very interested in taking everything we've learned over the last 30 years of our climate research program and applying it in the field. And that means using the networks that we've developed over time, working with the land-grant universities, working with crop extension, and working with now the private sector, the seed companies, the crop consultants, et cetera. And so with that, let me close.
Okay. My name is Margaret Davidson. Let me give you just a little background. Although I grew up in Tornado Alley in Texas, I gloriously misspent my late adolescence in South Louisiana, and I worked to clean up a little storm called Camille in '69, and I've been a disaster ghoul ever since. And for the last 30 years, I've called Charleston, South Carolina home, where I not only live on the marsh, but I live at 5.5 feet. So when I talk about these issues, it's not a professional, intellectual interest for me. It's actually a personal issue for me. It's my ox I'm goring. Finally, although I have little affiliation with the state of New Jersey, I do have 3 degrees from land-grant universities, including one from that little itty-bitty ocean state up the road. Okay, so you guys are in New Jersey. I'm going to tell you just one simple factoid about the coast, which you already know. It's not only where many of the people live, but it's where most of the nation's gross domestic product is generated. It is the economic engine of the US of A. And this little map of truck flows out of the Port of New Orleans shows you that coastal issues aren't just coastal issues. If you closed your eyes and squinted, which you can do even in the front row here, that almost looks like a USGS hydrology map. And so there is a relationship there. Now, I not only spend a lot of time with public resource managers, I spend a lot of time with non-public people. Because it takes the whole of society, intergovernmental, multi-sector, to address the kinds of issues we're talking about today. And I say that often the issue of extremes versus climate is kind of like golf. You've got to play it where it lays. So when I'm with the Chamber of Commerce, I don't actually talk about climate. I talk about extremes, because even Senator Inhofe may not get climate, but he sure as hell gets drought, right, Bill? So this is a slide from Munich Re, which is one of the world's largest reinsurance corporations, and I think it tells the story for us. The top bar is weather-related events over the last time period of not even 40 years, and the one below it is geophysical events. Think earthquakes and volcanoes. Now, there's a little distinction in those 2 sets of extreme events, isn't there? The one that's weather-driven has a different trend line than the one that's geophysically based. So to me, that's kind of intuitive. Something's going on with weather-related events. Oh, and you guys in New Jersey, last November, Dr. Abby Salinger published a seminal paper right before he died in December. What a great way to go out. I mean, if you got to go, seminal paper, right? My work's done. That sort of rather clearly demonstrated that the rate of sea level rise had dramatically accelerated in the mid-Atlantic over the last decade, which is entirely consistent with extreme model projections for accelerated Greenland ice sheet meltwater. So, I'm not saying they're related, I'm just telling you that the rate of sea level rise is accelerating, and it's consistent with some catastrophic collapse of the Greenland ice sheet projections. But I want to talk about trend, not model projections. And I want to talk about how today's flood is tomorrow's high tide. But more importantly, here's another set of trend lines. The billion-dollar disaster. It wasn't that long ago that we had the first billion-dollar disaster. And look at that trend line. It's pretty compelling, isn't it? And I'd like to say, since I've been through a few of these little storms myself, it's not a matter of 20 or 40 or 50-year return period. I'm suggesting that the return period is getting shorter all the time. And the other thing that you need to know, because I thought that was very interesting about the survey, listen, by this summer, when they announced that the drought is deeper and broader still, and when that next big storm hits next fall in the mid-Atlantic or the Gulf, you guys will be last year's news. So you have to remember that that happens. There's always another big event that's going to push you off the map. In the meantime, New Jersey is just 5th from the bottom in terms of how much it's going to cost you to do coastal adaptation. Now, why do I counterpose the billion-dollar disaster slide and the adaptation chart? For this reason. In the cases of drought, wildfire, and coastal inundation, it doesn't matter what the time scale is. It doesn't matter if we're talking about today or 3 decades from today. Everything that we need to do to drive down future disaster losses, to drive down future societal disruption is exactly the same. So if you're with someone who doesn't get the climate thing, that's fine. Talk to them about coastal flooding or talk to them about drought here and now and what we need to do to address it. Okay. So, Marjorie asked me to talk about some case studies. I'm going to borrow one down the coast from you guys. The lower tidewater region of Virginia is actually at a really big risk of flooding, particularly associated with storms and sea level rise. They got this little old port there called Norfolk. We have a bunch of Navy ships there. And a big OECD international group studied 2 years ago judged that Norfolk was one of the most at-risk ports in the entire planet. Okay? Now, Virginia is like my state, South Carolina, a strong haven of the Tea Party. So being climate forward in Virginia is not always the easiest thing possible, although they do have a fairly decent land-grant school there, too. Anyway, they had a big storm in 2011. You heard about Irene. And since that time, let's just say the people who want to do something about adaptation, reducing risk, community resilience have actually been making progress, spurred on by the Navy, which, of course, has actually been very aggressive. The Navy and Marines have actually been very aggressive for quite some time at working on sea level rise issues because they are one of the few truly water-dependent uses that there are. I mean, bait shops are nice, but ports and the Navy and the Marines, they actually got to be on the water for some reason. So anyway, local utilities have developed action tables and storm of record tables, and they've actually begun a whole process to look at not only their siting, but their design of future critical infrastructure. The Navy has actually already incorporated 16 feet of planning above current sea level into their infrastructure planning at Norfolk. And Norfolk, the city of Norfolk itself, the regional government is redesigning their 60-year-old drainage system. And they're actually using right now the National Climate Assessment Sea Level Rise Scenario document that either Jean or Marjorie can point you to. Then up the coast from you guys, in the town of Boston, they've been at this actually for about 8 years. In fact, Boston, Chicago, and Seattle and San Francisco, all liberal bastions, have actually been at this stuff for a while. Boston's engaged in a long-term process, and they had extensive community stakeholder engagement and just recently updated their plan 2 years ago. They have 8 different city agencies that are not only working on how do they incorporate changes in temperature and changes in water levels into their own organization's planning, but they're also beginning to work together. For instance, the Boston Conservation Commission actually is requiring all applicants to consider sea level rise over the design life of any project. The Redevelopment Authority, which is the Economic Development Authority, is asking the developers of new projects to consider the case of sea level rise and use a mid-range scenario, including for a new $6.3 million square foot project in South Boston. Emergency management is already on the train, and the Boston Water and Sewer Commission explicitly includes sea level rise and greater storm intensity as important factors for the stormwater and sewer system. Out in the land of fruits, nuts, and flakes, the middle part of California, there's a major effort among both public organizations and private conservation organizations to look at sea level rise, model vulnerabilities from sea level rise and storm hazards, including erosion and flooding. Erosion's a big issue here in New Jersey. Develop a setback plan in highly erosive areas. They're mapping infrastructure and ecosystem vulnerabilities. They're updating their conservation and landscape acquisition plans, and they're actually begun providing training on the use of a range of decision support tools and interactive maps. And they've completed a 1 to 3 meter DEM, 2 meter horizontal resolution from Half Moon Bay to Bodega Head, which is actually a really big deal. And they're doing some other interesting things. Just up the road in San Francisco, they've been working on these issues for quite some time. The Adapting to Rising Tides initiative has actually been one of the most visible adaptation planning processes in the state of California. They recognize that even regional projections were useless to them, and they've developed their whole set of sub-regional projections for San Francisco Bay, which only includes 45 jurisdictions, okay? That's what we call a cluster in a technical term. Anyway, so in 2009, those 45 jurisdictions came together and supported a regional vulnerability assessment, Living with the Rising Bay, which was a background for their 2011 Bay Plan amendments. They're now working on incorporating the implementation strategies across those multiple jurisdictions, and they've also done some really cool things with art contests and music contests, and they even developed a new little imagine how we would begin to live on the water. Can you live in pontoon boats? Or how would we do those kinds of things? So, you know, it's California. They're being very imaginative out there. I'm going to talk a minute about marine food, since fishing is actually a big deal for the New Jersey coast. Tony Broccoli showed you a bunch of stuff that clearly showed that the Northeast Ocean shelf temperatures were rising. What he didn't point out to you was that there have been already some, did I already move too fast? Yes, there's been some dramatic shifts in regional fish stock distribution. As you can see, a number of stocks have actually already begun to move north. That changes a lot of strategy. It changes how you think about not only your fishing ports and your onshore supply facilities, but for the fishing community itself. It actually requires that they think about their strategies differently. So it's actually the composition of species is changing, as well as where they are found. So if people are dependent on a particular fish stock, they're probably going to have to spend more energy to bring in the same amount of fish that they used to bring in. So that's another consequence. So getting back to my thing about how reducing risk associated with extreme events is exactly the same as adapting to climate change in many cases. Y'all have heard of the National Academy of Sciences. They produce dozens of reports every year. Once about every decade, several of the academies get together. In this case, the Academy of Engineering got together with the Academy of Science and produced a seminal report that was released last fall. I've actually excerpted some of the major recommendations on this. National resilience is an organizing principle. The second one is about the importance of the whole of society and how we need to work together to develop a risk management strategy that not merely focuses on structural and non-structural risk reduction issues, but that we also have to begin to look at other issues like pricing. The banking community, the financial services community, the insurance community, they have a lot to do with this. The only challenge is, at least for insurance commissioners, if they are not themselves elected, they're often appointed by elected officials, and we've already heard how well raising taxes goes in New Jersey. We're also going to be looking at establishing a national resource of disaster-related loss. I think you'll find that that'll be very useful, because here's what you need to know. When we talk about how much Sandy costs, we're only talking about the publicly and privately reimbursed losses to structures and some loss of business continuity. We are not talking about any environmental damage, and we're not talking about any social disruption, like the spikes in mental health and domestic abuse centers that go up right after the storm and often continue for years after, and are neither reimbursed by Uncle Sugar nor reimbursed by the State House. So yes, you get a big influx of revenues right after the storms, but it's the cost to keep on giving, even after all those carpetbaggers from the South have put your roof on badly for you. Okay, so there are some more recommendations, but the important one is this one. We need broad-based community resilience coalitions at local and regional levels. Risk reduction and resilience begins at home. Your neighborhood, your community group, your regional economic planning authority. It's not going to happen waiting for some Fed to do something, although you may get a little bit of money, but not as much as you used to. So let me talk about my particular passion on this issue. I'm a federal bureaucrat, so we call this green infrastructure. However, the Nature Conservancy has done a series of focus groups, and it tells us that normal people don't understand what green infrastructure is. Normal people don't understand what ecosystem services are, but normal people do get nature's defenses. That is, that Mother Nature can provide better wave and flood attenuation than almost anything that we can construct out of concrete. So after every big storm in this country, everybody goes, oh, let's be like the Dutch. Let's erect a massive storm surge barrier. So let me tell you about the Dutch experience. After 1,000 years of holding back the sea with concrete, they began 30 years ago to design and build the weir for the 10,000-year storm. Let me repeat that. 10,000-year storm. We can't even build a levee for a 100-year storm in this country. But anyway, they built that weir at an expense of about $100 billion, and they said, lo, this is insufficient to protect us from storm surge from the North Sea. What shall we do? And after 1,000 years of being the world's greatest engineers, they went, oh, let's design with Mother Nature. Let's make room for the river. So what are they doing there in the land of the supreme engineers? They are designing with Mother Nature. So yes, they will build offshore berms. They will renourish barrier islands. They will remediate, restore natural marshes and maritime forests. They'll build ridges and berms. They'll elevate and harden their highways. They'll put in floodgates. They'll elevate houses and commercial buildings. And they've begun a process to relocate people from low-lying marginal areas because they cannot afford to protect every place. Now, you're in New Jersey. Maybe we will fantasize that we can protect you. I'm in Charleston. I know we don't count for much. So I have no delusion on that factor. But if we're going to be like the Dutch, then let's take the Dutch experience in its whole and begin to figure out how we design with Mother Nature, how we make room for the river, and how we relocate people out of low-lying areas, even though nobody ever wants to do that. And finally, so I told you, I was a disaster ghoul. My personal friends often tell me what I can't talk about at a dinner party, but this is what we do for holidays. So, the time is now. You know, I'm from the Redneck Riviera, and for the last decade, I've listened to people talk about how hit a butt we must be to live where we live, right? But since Sandy, the discourse has changed. It's been elevated. So for the moment, there's interesting discussions going on up here in New Jersey and New York. The challenge will be, how do you keep that momentum going, and how do you get folks to work on these issues? So I often close out talks like this with my favorite tagline of late: adopt a troglodyte. In your family, in your neighborhood, in your church or civic group, each one of us knows one, each one of us should teach one, because the way we build momentum is by each one of us casting the ripples out beyond the believers. Climate change is not like the tooth fairy or religion, but we do have to start with simple persuasion, and that begins with each one of us. Thank you.
Well, I knew I was in trouble when I saw I was speaking after Margaret Davidson, who is known for those kinds of barn burners. But it's always a delight to actually speak on a panel with Margaret. Let me just start by saying a quick word about National Wildlife Federation, because I think that it has some relevance to the topic at hand. We recently celebrated our 75th anniversary, and what actually spurred the creation of my organization back in the 1930s was another crisis called the Dust Bowl and the crashing waterfowl populations taking place at that time, and the realization that if we didn't do something dramatic, we would have no ducks, we would have no waterfowl, we would have no wildlife, and that was in relation to a previous environmental crisis. So I think in crisis there is opportunity. And I think that is a take-home for us as we face the issue of climate change, which is, in our view, the greatest threat to wildlife and natural systems and ecosystems, in fact, society, that we will be facing. And so it's our challenge to rise to that. I'd also like to say that as a national organization, we actually do have a deep commitment to the state of New Jersey. In fact, our regional director, Curtis Fisher, is a native of New Jersey, and we have state affiliates in virtually all states, and our affiliate here in New Jersey is the New Jersey Audubon, who is a great local partner and doing wonderful work. I was asked to speak about climate change, adaptation, and natural resources. And I wanted to start by reflecting on the way we have done conservation for the past 100+ years, where we have typically identified those places that are special. We've attempted to either protect and preserve what we still have because we've lost so much, and we've attempted to go back to recreate the historical conditions that we have lost and we consider to be more desirable in various ways. You know, the kind of Yellowstones, these sort of iconic landscapes. But in the words of Yogi Berra, you know, the future ain't what it used to be, and those of us in the conservation community have to recalibrate our thinking about what successful conservation will be in a climate-altered future. And the problem is that the future is now. We're not talking about climate impacts in 50 years or 100 years. You know, you see all the charts that show what it's going to be like in 2050 and 2100. But in fact, as we heard earlier this morning, we're already experiencing climate impacts. I mean, the effects of Hurricane Sandy. I actually put this slide together before the tornadoes that came through a couple days ago. But whether you want to believe, you know, whether you can attribute any particular event, any particular tornado to climate change or not, that's sort of like asking, can you attribute any of Mark McGwire's home runs to those steroids or not? It's the percentages. So there's a lot of these impacts. The fire seasons, unlike we have ever seen before, the historic floods that are happening every, it seems like 2, 3, 4, 5 years, not every 100 years. And so what we have tended to do in the natural resource community is either manage for these historical conditions, or sometimes called reference conditions or benchmark conditions, or if we were more progressive, and in the 1990s there was a concept of ecosystem management that really was popularized. And the revelation then was, oh, you know, there's variability, so we don't want to just pick a particular point and manage to that, but we want to manage this, what was called the range of natural range of variability, or historic range of variability, you know, so that there's some variability, and you saw some of this on those previous climate slides, and we would use that as our basis. But for the most part, we considered climate to be kind of a stable entity, and that was not one of the factors that we were managing against. But in fact, as you saw many of those slides, it's actually now a shifting baseline. And so we really not only need to be managing for variability, but we need to be managing for change. Stationarity is dead, and that has long been a hallmark of our approach for managing natural resources, and we need to recognize that. I'm not going to speak a lot about the specific climate impacts on species and ecosystems, but just to highlight a couple, and you've already heard a few of them mentioned. For instance, Margaret mentioned the range shifts happening in marine species. Similar shifts are happening in terrestrial plants and animals. Often these things are moving northward or up in elevation to accommodate the rising temperatures. Mismatch in timing. So, for example, in the Delaware Bay, you have a large proportion of the world's population of red knots that is exquisitely timed to arrive in their long-distance migration just when the horseshoe crabs are mating, so that they can gorge on those eggs and fuel up for the next stage of their journey. Well, what we're beginning to see is shifts in timing of biological events. It's got a fancy word, it's called phenology. And when you break those matches, then you can see that you'll begin to have cascading ecological effects. Our ecosystems itself, we're starting to see altered processes, the frequency of fires, the intensity of fires, floods, changes in the compositions and structures. And then in particular, and this is especially important, it's not just that climate change itself is a new stressor, but it's exacerbating many of the existing issues and problems that our ecosystems are facing, whether from habitat loss and fragmentation, whether from non-native species that are spreading across the landscape, native pests For instance, the photo in the bottom here is mountain pine beetle damage in Colorado, where literally millions of acres of lodgepole pine are dying off because our winters are no longer warm enough to keep this native pest species in check. So I think that as we consider how we do adaptation, climate adaptation, I like to keep in mind the quote from the famous hockey player Wayne Gretzky, who, when he was asked, well, how is it that you make such amazing moves and do what you do, famously responded, I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been. And I think that that's really our challenge, not just in the ecosystem sector, but across societal sectors. And to me, it's also a little bit like some of these cooking shows. We were just talking about food. I don't have cable, so when I stay at a hotel like I did last night, sometimes I secretly watch these shows like Chopped or Iron Chef. I don't know who all has seen these, but basically you get these chefs competing against one another, and they're given a basket of weird stuff, like 3 disparate things, rutabagas, tuna eggs, and radicchio, and they're given half an hour to produce something tasty and attractive. And I think that climate adaptation, those of us that are dealing with this, are a little bit like these contestants in these Iron Chef shows. That is, we don't know what's going to hit us, but we know it's going to be odd combinations, and we know that it's going to require preparation and development of our skills in order to do context-specific assessments to actually address in an intelligent way these things. And so the question really is, what's in your basket is a combination of sea level rise and ecosystem disruption and wildfires, because each response, each adaptation response is going to be different. So it's not a matter of following some recipe book that says, here's how you do climate adaptation. It's a matter of the equivalent of learning how to cook. And so, using another food analogy, when we've looked across what is successful adaptation, we've come up with what I consider to be the secret sauce for successful adaptation. Now, I grew up out on the West Coast where we had Jack in the Box. I guess you guys don't have that. But those of you who have been there know that Jack in the Box used to put this secret sauce on their hamburgers. And the secret sauce of climate adaptation is intentionality. It's not enough just to say, we're working to make things more resilient. We're going to address existing stressors. You hear these sorts of things. We have to be very intentional in understanding what the specific impacts and vulnerabilities are, and then matching up our responses to those. So from a natural resource perspective, one thing that's clear is that in the face of climate change, just doing good conservation is no longer good enough. We need to act with intentionality. We also need to manage for change, not just persistence. A lot of the adaptation work that you see proposed is about trying to resist change, hold back the seas, keep it the way we've got it, figure out what we have to do in order to keep it the way it is. There will be places where that makes sense, but increasingly we're going to need to manage for change. One example of this, just down the coast in Delaware, we're working with the Delaware Fish and Wildlife Department. They've had a problem in Delaware with impoundments. This is Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge after Hurricane Sandy. These fresh and brackish water impoundments, which are important fish and wildlife habitat, were breached, salt water going in. Rather than just rebuilding the levees, they are going to do that here, by the way, but in the state of Delaware is actually beginning to shift some of these impoundments inland and upland to essentially manage for this change and create impoundments, fish and wildlife habitats that are more resilient and resistant to rising sea levels. We also need to reconsider our underlying conservation goals and not just our strategies, because many of our strategies are no longer going to be feasible. So one example of this, in northern Minnesota, colleagues of mine at Nature Conservancy have been working on restoration of northern forests, and they realized that when they looked at the projections of impacts, that many of the classic boreal species were not going to be there in the same quantity in 40, 50 years, and so they needed to recalibrate their restoration goals to take into account the kinds of tree species that were actually going to flourish 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now. One way that I like to think about this is aligning our adaptation goals and strategies. So you might think of this as we have our traditional business as usual, where we've got our traditional goals that line up with our traditional strategies. If we're a little more progressive in taking climate into consideration, we might do what I call climate retrofits. We still have our traditional goals, but we fiddle around with our strategies to try and continue meeting those goals. But what I would submit is that we actually need to do something that I call climate smart from the start, where we actually go through this process of figuring out whether or not our goals still make sense, if they need to be revised, and then come up with strategies that allow us to meet those climate-informed goals. The fourth major principle I wanted to put on the table is to integrate this with existing work. It's not about creating an adaptation plan over here and doing your real work over there, because you know what happens with that. It's like, that's not my job. No one's paying me to do that. We have to bring these things together, and I think that's one of the great things about this conference. It's across sectors, and it's how we work this into the fabric of our existing activities and planning processes. One of the things that we at National Wildlife Federation have been doing is working to develop guidance on how to actually put climate adaptation into practice, these principles into practice. And we've been focusing on what we refer to as climate smart conservation, in part because the word adaptation is wonky. No one really understands what that means. But we've been developing guidance on things like climate vulnerability assessments and pulling together work groups to develop guidance on climate smart conservation. And we've developed a framework. I'm not going to work through it, but it encompasses these kinds of ideas of understanding your vulnerabilities, revising and reviewing your goals, and then matching up what your options are with those vulnerabilities and reducing your risks and vulnerabilities. We also came up with a set of what we call key characteristics of climate smart conservation. And again, I'm not going to walk through all of these except to say, linking your actions to your impacts and your forward-looking goals are really at the heart of them. But following on some of the things that Margaret mentioned, I wanted to highlight a couple of them, which is that one of the key characteristics is that we should be safeguarding both people and wildlife and avoiding what we would call maladaptation, doing one action that we think is going to reduce our vulnerability for one sector, but in fact, inadvertently, or advertently, I guess, increasing our vulnerability in another area. And so Margaret talked a lot about these natural solutions. Often, one of the buzzwords that's been developed is ecosystem-based adaptation. That isn't about protecting ecosystems from climate change for the sake of wildlife and ecosystems. It's about how we use ecosystems to help safeguard people and property. And so it's really about using these nature-based solutions or nature's defenses to do a better job of safeguarding, reducing risk and safeguarding communities. And so these nature-based solutions or a green infrastructure, as they're often referred to, is really something that is going to be embedded into our climate adaptation and disaster response and rebuilding activities. But there's still a lot that we need to know. We need to better understand when and where these nature-based approaches work so that we can put it in place where they make sense and not where they don't. But they do make sense in a lot of areas. And I would also suggest that we need to green these green infrastructure projects because we need to ensure that they actually have ecological benefits. So there's a whole array of what is classed as green infrastructure, some of which is about planting grass and some of which is about planting stuff and building and recreating natural systems that truly have ecological function. So just to sum up, I wanted to leave you with these 4 high-level principles that we think inform climate adaptation from a natural resource and ecosystem perspective. That first is acting with intentionality. Again, really understanding why we are doing and how this reduces is tied into reducing the specific climate impacts and vulnerabilities. Secondly, managing for change and not just persistence, really accepting the fact that we are going to need to adjust to these coming changes, and we won't be able to resist them entirely. Third, reconsidering our underlying goals and not just dabbling at the strategy level. And that's going to be a difficult discussion because there's psychological challenges, there's legal challenges, there's political challenges. And then finally, integrating our adaptation into our existing work. But I think that if we embrace these 4 principles and the specific strategies that, for instance, you can find in the recently published National Fish, Wildlife, and Plant Climate Adaptation Strategy, I think that we will have the ability to rise to this challenge. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're right on schedule. We'll have 15 minutes for questions. We're going to open the floor to questions right now. We'll go till 10:45, at which point we'll have a 15-minute break. Oh, okay, and there's a mic out there, so please would you head to the mic with your question. And we will reconvene at 11 o'clock. So now it's time to ask the hard questions. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, everyone. Hi, Bruce. It's been 30 years since we traipsed around the rainforest in Costa Rica on the OTS course. It seems like it was yesterday. I have a question for you. In New Jersey, we're sort of lucky in the Pine Barrens. It's sort of a southern ecosystem at its most northern limit, and it's fairly easy to see how to do all those things when dealing with taking care of our Pine Barrens forest. I'm really worried about our Highlands forest because any perturbation in the last 25, 30 years has resulted in nothing but invasive weeds from other parts of the world taking over at every level: canopy, shrub layer, herbaceous layer, soil layers with earthworms. I cannot imagine how we're going to be able to plan for adaptation outside of the Pine Barrens in New Jersey forests because I just don't see any ability to deal with perturbation in those forests anymore. There might be places like Florida, maybe you know with your vast international experience. I'm wondering if there's a place where we can look where people are dealing with the kind of invasive species problems we have in New Jersey and how to deal with it.
Well, is this, well, thank you, and I do fondly remember those courses down in Costa Rica that we took together, but that does seem like a lifetime ago. The question that you put forward is really challenging, and that has to do with, as a lot of these changes take place, there are going to be winners and losers within the biological community, and unfortunately what we find is that many of the species that we most care about, our native species, tend to be the ones on the losing side, and those on the winning side often are widespread common species, but also increasingly these non-native invasive species that seem to be well adapted to taking advantage of these shifting changes. It's a really difficult issue when these are well embedded in a system. What I would say is that there are some opportunities to look to the future to figure out where invasive species might actually be moving and trying to get ahead of the curve. So this is, I'm punting a little bit on the challenge of how do we address our existing problem of non-native and invasive species transforming our ecosystems. But when you look at what's possible to do, not just in the realm of climate change, but more generally, preventing new invasions is one of the most cost-effective efforts. And so we need to, first of all, beef up our border security, not just from a human immigration standpoint, but actually from a biosecurity standpoint. But what we've also begun to see is that some of the techniques used to predict how range shifts in invasive species will take place will allow us to specifically target and put in place early detection and rapid response programs to try and keep new invaders out of some of our most sensitive ecosystems. So, but I agree that is it's an intractable problem in many ways. Bill, I don't know if you have some comments.
Oh, sure. I actually know the region you're talking about. It's where I spent my forestry field camp while I was here at Rutgers. Is this working?
There you go.
There we go. Yes. So I know the region. I think that's right. There are certainly going to be winners and losers, and you know, when it comes to even putting the question of invasives aside, you know, early successional species are going to be favored as, you know, with the disturbances that we see from climate change. And so even within forest ecosystems, you're going to see that sort of shift. And then you fold invasives on top of that. The work within USDA, both within Forest Service and within APHIS, our Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. Or, you know, we're developing strategies specifically to deal with the issue of invasives, and then layering climate change on top of that, trying to identify species that we need to be beefing up inspection on and trying to identify before, you know, they hit. And then now that many of them are here, and in fact, it sounds like what you're seeing in the northwest part of the state is that you're already seeing, you know, these problems. Within each of our national forests, we've asked our forest managers to develop climate change adaptation plans. And it's well-intentioned. We have 153 national forests. The first question that we got from our forest managers was, okay, tell us how the climate's going to change and we can begin to manage for it. We need to do a lot of work in terms of providing the support systems to help resource managers in the field deal with the changes that are expected. And that's going to require, you know, working through our existing infrastructure of extension and outreach, and developing new tools to reach out to the folks that are actually dealing with these issues in the field.
Thanks very much.
Can you please introduce yourself as well before you pose your question so we know? No problem.
That was Emil DeVito.
Thank you.
I'm Judith Weiss. I have a question for Bruce also, which is how, when you're planning a kind of a restoration or something, how far ahead, how do you pick how far ahead? You mentioned in Minnesota where they were going to plant trees that are the ones that are going to be there 50 years from now. We have similar issues with marsh restoration along the coasts in terms of what sea level are we going to, what level are we going to put these marshes so that they'll still be around? But how far ahead? And how do you decide whether you want to do a 50-year ahead or a 100-year ahead? And you know it's going to be underwater eventually, or you know those trees are going to be, you know, it's going to become too hot for them eventually, and so forth. Just how do you, what's the thinking process, and how do you do it?
It's a great question, and one that we're increasingly challenging ourselves with, because it's clear that there need to be transition strategies. That is, we can't just say, okay, if we're going to lose this particular marsh, then let's work to replace it for something that's going to be robust in 100 years, because there's sort of an interim stage. And it's also true that there are benefits that are the marshes that are currently at risk and will be drowned in a 15 or 20-year period are providing that we don't want to give up on. And so, as much as anything, it's important to be clear about your time period, as opposed to simply say one should always plan for a 50-year or 100-year horizon, but simply be aware that if you're investing in a project that's going to have a 20-year lifespan, you're scaling your investments in a way that also either has the ability for that to sort of transition and create something where that marsh can migrate inland, or have some other backup plan. And I think Margaret looks like she's got some thoughts about this as well. Did you want to
Well,
add?
I think your point's well taken, but I think even the conservative scenario of 3 meters is a reasonable starting place, because it will certainly see you through at least much of this century. Now, the confidence, that scientific term, that confidence in a higher level of the rate of rise of the water level is a little more sketchy in the middle to higher scenarios. And for those of you who don't know what the high scenario is, there are some, including Jim Hansen, who may be known to some of you in the audience, who thinks that we're actually looking at 5 meters by 2100. Meters. That's a technical term. So 5 meters would be very close to 20 feet. Okay, 3 meters would be very close to 10 feet. So conservatively, to plan for a 10-foot rise in the water level on the New Jersey coast by 2100 is, I believe, a very conservative strategy. And I agree with Bruce that you have to actually have a transition, because there are going to be marshes that you cannot save. At the same time that you're working on the gradient for areas that might now be merely high tide or intermittent flood, and they may actually be your main stock marsh in 30 to 50 years.
In New Jersey, the marshes have very little room to move inland.
Well,
We've
there
got
is-
Route 1 and a whole bunch of towns there.
There is that concrete problem. So marshes can migrate as long as there's enough sediment, which we have impeded with dams in the Northeast, but they have a terrible time migrating across concrete. Same holds true for trees. They really can't jump 80 feet easily.
Hello. My name is Eleanor Saunders, and I work in the Energy and Environment Program at the Council of State Governments in our Eastern Regional Office. I'd like to draw on the national perspective that all three of you have and ask you about what states you think are particularly good models for turning the adaptation plans that many of our states have into really productive actions. Because I think there's often a gap between what you've got on paper and what you actually start doing. And I'm interested especially in sort of a comprehensive state level movement, because there are a lot of interesting local projects, but I'm interested in the states as a whole.
So Bruce talked about mainstreaming. I'm not sure that's the word he used, but not having a standalone adaptation plan, but putting it in your sustainability plan, putting it in your regional infrastructure plan, putting it in your regional economic development plan. But for me, I think, at least from a coastal perspective, the most important thing we could do is get much smarter about where we site and how we design critical infrastructure, roads, water, and sewer, because they drive everything else, including where the humans are going to be. So, you know, in the short run, the stuff that you don't want to relocate, then you got to figure out how to elevate and harden. But in the future, the stuff you're planning now, you're trying to figure out how to put the bond bills for. Why are we still putting critical infrastructure inside the 10-year floodplain? We're going to have to go towards regional infrastructure anyway, because very few local governments can even afford this stuff anymore. So that move towards regional money pooling, so you can buy down your cost of infrastructure, that's the time to strike. It's the siting that matters. The design part's easy, but the preferred sites for your regional authorities and your preferred sites for the Chamber of Commerce will drive your future loss profiles.
To answer your question with regard to states that are being proactive, I was one of the lead authors on a report on climate change in rural communities for this latest national climate assessment, and I had the opportunity to pull in some of the work that is going on in Maryland with regard to their state adaptation plans, and I think that may be a good model. There's certainly an equal amount of work going on in New Jersey, but certainly collaboration. There are many of the issues that are being dealt with in Maryland are similar to the issues that you're going to be dealing with in New Jersey with regard to transportation, with regard to natural resources, water, and so that may be a good model. And then, many cities are actually taking the lead. New York, Seattle, Chicago, and so there are good models there as well.
Thank you.
because we're going to really try to stay on schedule today, but our panelists are staying through the break, so you have a chance to chat with them then. Please join me in thanking our first panel and our moderator, Nick DiNiccolo.